Dolmen, described as an action RPG by developer Massive Work Studio, is a game that entertains and frustrates me in equal measure. Despite any early marketing push and lingering storefront descriptions, it's a traditional sci-fi Souls-like, similar to The Surge or Hellpoint. It's a compact and brisk experience, made on a budget, which I'm fine with, but what's less forgivable are some design choices, and a lack of combat polish that has persisted since the preview build. As a result, Dolmen is a game in which you never know if wonky hitboxes are going to keep you alive in the final moments of a tense boss fight, or see you hit by a projectile through a wall and flung into an environmental hazard. Now, Dolmen's premise, which takes inspiration from several classic sci-fi and horror tales, is intriguing. It doesn't take the From Software approach of obscure, indirect storytelling, but the alternative isn't that much better, with flashback sequences and banter between the protagonist and their shipboard AI handling 90% of the storytelling. In Dolmen's universe, corporations have established mines on numerous planets to extract resources for the colonies, relying on genetically modified humans to better survive harsh conditions. The robust drillers of Revian Prime, barely human in appearance, have been mining the titular dolmen, a mineral found on the planet, capable of weakening the barrier between dimensions when bombarded with energy. It's your protagonist's job to contain the outbreak, find any survivors, recover dolmen samples, and discover a way to prevent future incidents, something they seem to take in their stride despite the novel threat. Sure, if you examine every glowing background terminal, you can learn a little more about the cultish mining corporation that contacted beings from an alternate dimension and decided to invite them in, despite having built their facilities on top of the ruins of the last civilization that tried. Just don't go in expecting gear with detailed lore descriptions, bosses with tragic backstories, or any thematically meaningful designs beyond interdimensional monstrosities. The narrative is superficially interesting, but it won't win any rewards for writing quality, and it fails to flesh out the universe further if they have plans for sequels. Now, from a gameplay perspective, the premise allows for more environmental diversity than many of its peers. Interdimensional rifts result in a merging of Revian Prime's sci-fi facilities, natural cave systems, and the hostile surface, with ancient ruins and biomechanical hives. Similarly, the bosses and creatures you encounter range from skittering to flying insect-like beasts, robotic guards with dual blades and blasters, and even armor-clad alien warriors. Despite the limited scope, Dolmen at least tries to change up the scenery and the potential threats frequently. If you've played any From Software game, or any other third-person Souls-inspired game, the basics will be instantly familiar. You have slow and methodical movement, light, heavy jumping, sprinting, and parrying attacks, stamina management for attacking, blocking, and dodging, dangerous enemies that'll take chunks out of your health bar if you're not cautious, a limited number of heals between beacons, think bonfires, collecting nanites to level up your attributes back in the ship, basically the same as Souls. There's also farming of resources to forge new gear or enhance your own, and perhaps the genre's most divisive mechanic, dealing with respawning enemies and corpse runs when you die. Dolmen's novel mechanic is a dedicated energy bar that adds a new tactical layer. It can only be recharged by consuming a limited number of batteries, which are replenished at beacons and rarely dropped, so you need to decide when to consume a chunk of it to heal, when to burn through it all to inflict a flurry of elementally charged melee attacks, or when to keep it topped up as a slowly recharging ammunition pool for your ranged weapons. Having played many From Software titles, and several Souls-likes, Dolmen was unexpectedly unforgiving thanks to high enemy damage, pretty cheap ambushes, both stationary and mobile environmental hazards, boss attacks that I'm sure are one-hit kills, and several design choices and technical issues I'll discuss in a bit. Having said that, Dolmen still manages to tap into a familiar and satisfying rhythm. Despite the odds, your protagonist can still dole out damage quickly, but the challenge comes from finding the perfect moment to strike, while still leaving enough time to disengage and avoid retaliation. Mass combat is unwise, and you'll want to isolate enemies early on, or use your ranged weapons' elemental attacks to stagger approaching groups. When it comes to the boss fights, Dolmen features enjoyable one-on-one battles that'll test your powers of observation and reflexes, though there are a few that rely on spawning mobs mid-fight, while the worst were gimmicky indirect battles that led to several deaths as I simply tried to figure out what I was meant to be doing. Appropriately, those bosses feel like significant roadblocks, especially given you can reach them in quick succession after traversing relatively small environments. However, it was at the end of the first chapter, after committing maybe a dozen attribute points to my build, that I realized the escalating upgrade cost made grinding conventional foes pointless. Then, while sifting through the crafting menus, I realized the best gear required multiple components only dropped by defeating a boss. At this point it finally clicked for me that Dolmen wants you to grind the bosses to bolster your character. The payoff is, initially, quite satisfying. The gear you craft increases your affinity with one of 3 perk trees, Human, Revian, and Driller, each with a distinct focus: energy and firearms, endurance and melee weapons, resistances and nanite gain respectively. There's not a massive number of items to craft. but higher tier gear offers affinity boosts across multiple perk trees and allows you to socket more bonus material, which also comes in different rarity tiers, to further modify armor resistances or elemental weapon damage. Despite this revelation, numerous issues became more apparent the further I got. Dolmen fragments, a resource infrequently dropped by basic foes, are used to both summon multiplayer support for boss battles and respawn defeated bosses to grind for nanites and crafting resources. Bizarrely, these fragments also drop on death. Annoying enough if you died repeatedly in a new area and just want to respawn several bosses to grind, but also means if you fall to a boss playing solo and require assistance to progress, you have to grind for 3 more of these for each multiplayer attempt. Unfortunately, there's a more fundamental problem. The combat is just as janky and inconsistent as it was 6 months ago. Movement is stiff yet floaty. Switching rapidly between melee and ranged weapons can cause the camera and lock-on to bug out. Choreographed attacks range from obvious to non-existent, and the hitboxes are inconsistent. There were many times I'd be hit by an unblockable attack despite dashing well out of the animation range, whereas other times I was caught by a stunning attack, only to have the follow-up blows pass right through me harmlessly. At times I was thrilled I survived an encounter with a sliver of health, but all too often it meant messy fights and excessive healing. Moving back to the positives, Dolmen can look great for a budget title, offering up a ray-traced 30 frames per second quality mode and 60 frames per second performance mode for current-gen consoles. Now, although the ray-traced reflections look fantastic in many areas with shiny and slick surfaces, the fluidity and responsiveness offered by the performance mode is a better fit for the genre. Most environments and creature models veer towards generic, with few distinctive or thematic elements, but there's enough diversity to keep things interesting. The one notable downside is the segmented nature of the world, with distinct areas you load into, and no real sense of a connected space. When I did find a path leading back to another zone, it mostly felt like a redundant checklist feature, as you can teleport between beacons anyway. While I didn't find the music particularly memorable, the ambient soundscape kept me on edge as I tentatively pushed forward, and loud weapon impacts made the combat feel visceral, assuming your blows aren't passing straight through enemies. So, looping back to my opening statement, Dolmen leaves me conflicted. There have been plenty of budget Souls games released over the last decade, but even those with a similar scope and streamlined mechanics, think Lords of the Fallen or the Surge games, had tighter and more consistent combat. With an interesting premise, tactile energy management system, streamlined crafting, and impactful gear-based perks, Dolmen has decent foundations. However, several frustrating mechanics and the wonky hitboxes undermine the experience. At launch, I think Dolmen is best suited for gamers that consider the Souls-like genre their bread and butter, and are willing to endure some jank in pursuit of a new challenge. If you consider yourself more of a casual player, you might be better off holding out for several patches to improve the balance and polish the experience further.